Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
It happened on a Sunday, one of those gray, humid days where the sky feels heavy and even the air has an attitude. I'd just finished enduring another of my mother's drawn-out, passive-aggressive family dinners, the kind where she pretends everything is normal while taking little jabs at your life choices. As if you don't notice her tone when she says things like, "Oh, you're still working from home? That's cozy." Bryce had been holding court at the head of the table as usual, regaling everyone with updates about his company, his big plans, and his latest gym routine, as if we were all dying to know about his protein intake. I barely said 5 sentences all evening, but that was the usual rhythm. Bryce spoke, Mom nodded, and I existed in the silence between them. I was halfway to my car when I heard it. A thick, dull thunk that made my spine twitch. You know the sound. Not loud like a crash, more like a fist hitting sheet metal. I turned just in time to see the basketball roll lazily across the driveway. And there he was, Bryce, standing by the passenger side of my car, holding nothing but that smug grin of his and all the goddamn audacity in the world. The kind of smirk only a man who's never been held accountable could wear with that much confidence. "Oops," he said with a shrug, as if he'd accidentally stepped on a bug. "It's not like you even paid for it." And just like that, the years I'd spent keeping calm and biting my tongue cracked open like thin glass under a boot. I didn't even answer him at first. I just reached into my purse, took a slow breath, and pulled out the title. I kept it in a thin plastic folder, clean, crisp, protected like it was holy. I unfolded it deliberately, turned it toward him, and held it up at chest height like a priest offering scripture. My voice was low but clear. "Actually," I said, "I did, and it's mine, in every legal and moral way that matters." Bryce froze. His smirk faltered just enough to give me satisfaction. He wasn't expecting that. Probably assumed I was still the same little sister who wouldn't stand up to him, who would sigh and let it go because that's just Bryce being Bryce. That's the thing with men like him. They get so used to people letting them off the hook that they forget the hook ever existed. "You carry the title around with you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow like I was the crazy one. "Only when I know I'll be seeing you," I replied. The truth was I hadn't planned this moment. I hadn't even looked at the title in months. But something about that night, maybe it was the 4th or 5th condescending comment from him, or the way Mom had glanced at me when I asked for more mashed potatoes, like I should be watching my weight, had stirred something in me. A quiet defiance that had long been resting just under the surface, waiting for the right insult to rise. The silence between us stretched. He stared at the document, trying to process it, trying to find a comeback that didn't exist. His usual tricks, sarcasm, charm, denial, none of them were working. "Uncle Jack gave me this car," I said. "Not you, not Mom, me. Because I was the one who showed up when he got sick. I was the one who took him to his appointments. You ghosted him for 2 straight years." Bryce's jaw clenched. He hated being called out, especially when the facts were undeniable. "He wanted me to have it," I added, quieter now, but firmer. "And he made sure I did." I walked around to the passenger side, eyes scanning the dent. It was about the size of a grapefruit, maybe a little smaller, just above the door handle. The paint was chipped, the metal warped in a way that would never quite look the same, even after a repair. It was a careless wound. Not the kind that happens because of bad luck, but the kind that happens when someone just doesn't give a damn. "Nice aim," I muttered. He scoffed, trying to regain ground. "It's a car, Nat. It's not sacred." "It is to me," I said, "and you don't get to decide what matters to me anymore." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about the car. Not really. This was about every single moment he'd brushed me off, talked over me, gotten away with things I'd never even dare try. It was about our entire childhood, where he was the golden boy, and I was the emotional one, the sensitive one, the one who took things too seriously. It was about every damn Christmas where he showed up late, and still got the biggest present. Every birthday where he didn't call and Mom made excuses for him. Every lie he told that she forgave instantly while mine were dissected like crimes. "It's just a car," he repeated. "Yeah," I said, folding the title back into my bag. "And that dent? That's just a scratch." He stared at me, eyes narrowing, probably trying to figure out if I was bluffing, if I was planning something. I didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing either way. Instead, I turned toward the driver's side, opened the door, and got in. But before I closed it, I looked at him one last time. "You should be more careful," I said, "about what you hit. Some things hit back." I started the engine and pulled away slow, letting the gravel under my tires speak for me. As I turned out of the driveway, I glanced at the side mirror and saw him still standing there, not moving, not smirking. For the first time in years, Bryce looked small. And me, I had a dented door and a plan forming so fast in my head, it made my heartbeat feel like thunder in my chest. He thought it was over. He had no idea it had just begun. The next morning, I stood in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out the window like I expected the world to suddenly shift shape. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the kind of laziness that only early autumn allows, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at nothing. But I wasn't hearing any of that. I was still replaying Bryce's voice in my head, his smug tone, the way he'd said it like a joke he expected me to laugh at. "It's not like you even paid for it." That sentence had unzipped something inside me, and now I couldn't stop the memories from pouring out. It had been Uncle Jack's car before it was mine. A deep cherry red 1968 Chevy Impala with leather seats that cracked when the weather got too dry, and a low, thunderous engine growl that made people turn their heads when it passed by. Jack had babied that car for years. He didn't just drive it. He polished it like a ritual, changed the oil himself, and parked it under a custom cover in the garage. He used to call it his third child, which always made Mom laugh awkwardly, like she didn't want to acknowledge the obvious sting in that joke. Because the truth was, Jack didn't have kids of his own, but he treated me like the daughter he never had. And everyone in the family knew it, even if they didn't say it out loud. Jack was my dad's younger brother, and after Dad passed, he'd kind of filled that void without asking for anything in return. When I was 22 and fresh out of college, broke and drifting, it was Jack who gave me a room over his garage and taught me how to change a tire and balance a budget. Bryce had already moved out by then, living in a condo downtown and chasing whatever job sounded impressive at the time. He barely called. Jack noticed, but he never said anything ugly about it. He just shrugged and said, "Some people give more when they're not asked to. That's you." By the time Jack got sick, it was me driving him to his chemo appointments, me making sure he took his meds on time, me picking up groceries, handling the bills, and sitting with him on the bad days when he could barely get out of bed. Bryce came by exactly twice, once for Christmas and once the day after Jack's birthday because he'd had a thing. I never said anything, never asked for help. Part of me thought maybe if I handled it all, Jack would get better. That if I held enough pieces together, the whole damn thing wouldn't fall apart. But cancer doesn't care about effort. Jack died in early March 2 years ago, just as the snow was starting to melt. A week after the funeral, I got a letter from his attorney, and in it 2 things: the title to the Impala and a short handwritten note in Jack's wobbly scrawl. "You took care of me when no one else did. This was always yours." I remember crying in the parking lot of the law office, the kind of tears that don't make noise, just fall and fall while the world moves around you like nothing's happened. I didn't tell anyone about the note. I figured it would just spark drama, and I wasn't in the mood to defend something that had already been decided. But apparently, silence doesn't stop people from assuming the worst. Bryce and Mom had both convinced themselves the car had ended up in my hands by accident, like I'd found it in a box of cereal or talked the lawyer into it with some manipulative sob story. When I brought the car home that spring, Bryce made a comment at dinner. "Classic ride like that belongs to a real collector, not someone who's going to use it for grocery runs." and Mom had laughed. Not politely, not gently, she had actually laughed, like what he said was harmless, like it wasn't designed to sting. It always came back to the same thing. Whatever I hadn't earned. Not in their eyes. That evening, after I finished pacing around the kitchen like a dog circling its own tail, I called Mom. I wanted to tell her what Bryce had done, about the dent, the smirk, the title in his face. But as soon as she answered, her voice already carried that defensive edge that told me she'd heard from him first. "I don't know what's going on between you two," she said sharply before I even got a word out. "But Bryce said you threw the title in his face and embarrassed him." I laughed, dry and joyless. "He dented the car. I showed him proof it was mine. That's not embarrassing him. It's reminding him of reality." "He's going through a lot right now," she replied. Of course he was. Bryce was always going through a lot, no matter how good his life actually was. He could be working a 6-figure job, vacationing in Cancun, and still Mom would find a way to excuse his bad behavior. I felt something burn low in my chest. So was Uncle Jack. You remember him, right? The man who actually left me that car? Mom's silence cracked through the phone line like thunder. She didn't like it when I used facts she couldn't bend. "I still think he should have left it to both of you," she said after a beat. "It was a family car." "No, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "It was Jack's car, and he chose." "You don't get to rewrite that just because it makes you uncomfortable." There was a pause. Then in a lower tone, almost accusatory, "You think you're better than him just because you played nurse?" That hit harder than I was ready for. Not because it was true, but because it wasn't. I hadn't taken care of Jack for praise or pity or inheritance. I did it because he needed someone and no one else showed up. I did it because I loved him. And now I was the one being scolded for it. "You want to talk about what's fair?" I said slowly. "Let's talk about the clause." She didn't answer, but I could almost hear her breath catch. "I know about the clause in the will," I continued. "The one Jack added after Bryce took $5,000 out of his account and never paid it back." Still silence, but now it was the guilty kind. "You didn't think I knew about that, did you?" I waited, but she said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. For the first time in years, I felt something shift. Like maybe I wasn't crazy for feeling what I'd felt all along. Like maybe all those dinners, all those sideways glances, all those offhand comments, they weren't just accidents. They were patterns. Proof. I hung up without another word. Bryce had dented my car, sure, but that was nothing compared to the way they'd all spent years denting my sense of worth, my version of reality, my space in this family. The difference now? I had the proof, the title, the clause, and something else they never expected me to have: a plan. The first time Uncle Jack mentioned the clause to me, he was sitting in his favorite recliner, one of those ancient leather things that groaned every time he shifted, and staring at the muted television like it owed him money. I had just brought him dinner, something bland and manageable for his stomach, and he was poking at it with his fork more than eating. The chemo had made him weak, but it hadn't touched the sharpness in his eyes. That night, there was something heavier in his expression, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to say something he knew I wasn't ready to hear, but he had run out of time to keep holding it. "You know," he said, not looking at me directly, "I made some changes to the will last week." I remember setting the tray down on the side table and raising my eyebrows, not really sure what to say. Jack didn't talk about death in the usual morbid way. He treated it like an annoying appointment on the calendar that kept getting closer. So when he mentioned the will, it felt less like a dramatic moment and more like a casual update. But then he added something that made me stop in my tracks. "I put in a clause," he said, finally turning his head to look at me, "specifically about the car. It's yours, Nat. No contest, no conditions. And anything inside it goes to you too." At the time, I didn't think much about the anything inside it part. I figured he meant the registration or the old maps he kept in the glove box. I thanked him, sat beside him for a while, and changed the channel to something dumb to distract us both from how heavy the air had become. I didn't realize until much later, until I had the title in hand and the keys jangling in my purse, that Jack had meant more than I understood. After the fight with Bryce and the phone call with Mom, I found myself standing in the garage late that night, the light from a single overhead bulb casting long shadows across the floor. The Impala sat quiet, as it always did, its paint still gleaming even under the dim light. It looked untouched by time, but I knew better. Time touches everything. It just hides its fingerprints better on some things. I opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, the smell of old leather and motor oil comforting in a way I can't explain. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, trying to figure out what exactly I was chasing. Was it validation, revenge, closure, or just the satisfaction of knowing, for once, that I wasn't crazy for thinking things had always been unfair? Reaching over, I opened the glove box. Inside was a small brown leather journal that I'd seen before but never paid much attention to. I thought it was just for notes, maybe mileage logs or repair schedules. Jack was meticulous like that. But when I opened it and started flipping through the pages, I realized this wasn't a logbook. It was something else entirely. The entries started normal enough. Notes about oil changes, parts replaced, little jokes about the way the car purred like a spoiled cat. But a few pages in, the tone shifted. There were dates, names, observations, mentions of Bryce that made my stomach clench. Bryce came by today, asked if he could borrow money again, said it was for a project. I told him I'd think about it, but I already knew I wouldn't. Last time he never paid me back. Said it was a miscommunication. $5,000 doesn't just vanish from your account by mistake. I stopped reading for a second, my hand gripping the edges of the book like it might fall out of my lap. My brother had told me for years that Jack was forgetful toward the end, that he didn't always know what he was saying, but this was clear, precise, undeniable. Jack had known exactly what was happening, and he hadn't forgotten. He'd just chosen to protect me quietly, the way nobody else ever had. I flipped forward. Left Natalie the car. No matter what Carol says, I know she'll try to stir something up, but the clause makes it airtight. She can't touch it, neither can Bryce. They'll try, maybe, but Natalie's stronger than they think. That line broke something open inside me. I don't know if it was grief or relief or a twisted combination of both, but I felt the tears sliding down my face before I even realized I was crying. Not the dramatic, movie-style sobbing, just quiet, exhausted tears that carried too many years of biting my tongue and pretending I didn't see the favoritism, the gaslighting, the way I was always expected to be the bigger person while Bryce was given excuse after excuse. There were more entries, some long, some just a few lines, all of them careful, deliberate, and laced with the kind of truths that the families bury under politeness. Jack had kept receipts, not just financial ones, but emotional ones. Evidence of every slight, every betrayal, every time he'd watched Mom cover for Bryce or twist the truth to make me look like the problem. Toward the back, there was a page marked with a folded corner, and something told me before I even turned to it that this was the part Jack had wanted me to find. The entry was dated 6 months before he died. If she ever needs proof, it's all here. The bank statements, the forged check copies, and the contact for the lawyer. I hope it never comes to that. But if it does, she'll know what to do. I sat there in the car, journal resting against my chest, and felt something new blooming beneath the ache. Not joy, not even satisfaction, just a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. Quiet power, the kind that doesn't need to shout, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. Bryce had always assumed I would fold, that I'd let things go because I always had. But this wasn't about being petty anymore. This was about setting the record straight, about drawing a line in the sand and daring anyone to step over it again. I locked the journal back in the glove box and sat in the dark garage for a while longer, listening to the silence. The Impala seemed to hum with approval, like it had been waiting for me to find the truth it had carried all this time. Not just the story of ownership, but the story of betrayal, of trust, of choosing who we love and who we let hurt us over and over again. The clause in Jack's will wasn't just a legal measure. It was a final act of protection, a final act of belief. He knew they would come for me, even after he was gone, but now I had what I needed, and they had no idea what was coming. The next few days passed like the quiet stretch of land before a tornado touches down. Tense, still, but filled with a charge that made your skin itch. I went through the motions of work, the endless emails, the scheduled meetings, the small talk I barely heard myself participating in. But my mind never left the journal. Every time I opened a new browser tab or typed out a sentence, that small leather-bound book hovered in the back of my thoughts like a shadow waiting for a light strong enough to make it visible. I'd placed it back in the glove box after reading through it, but something about that felt wrong, like leaving a loaded gun lying on the kitchen table and pretending no one would notice. Eventually, I moved it into the house, tucked it under a pile of old sweaters in the back of my bedroom closet, the kind of spot no one would think to check unless they were looking for something they weren't supposed to find. Bryce hadn't called, not a word. That didn't surprise me. When he felt cornered, he never confronted. He waited, then circled back like a hawk waiting for something smaller to move. He knew how to play the long game, and worse, he believed he was always the smartest one in the room. That belief made him reckless in ways he never noticed, especially with people who kept receipts. People like me. But on Wednesday evening, around 6, I got the text. Just 5 words. "You still mad about Sunday?" No greeting, no apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd done or what it had meant. Just his usual routine: minimize, deflect, joke it away. For years, I had let that work. I'd laughed when I didn't feel like laughing, waved off the insult wrapped in sarcasm, convinced myself that if I kept the peace long enough, maybe he'd eventually see me as an equal. But peace is only noble when both sides are interested in keeping it. Otherwise, it's just surrender with better branding. I didn't respond. Instead, I reread the journal again, from start to finish this time, paying attention to every detail, every underlined word, every angry scratch in the margins. Jack hadn't written like a man full of bitterness. He'd written like someone deeply disappointed, like someone who had held out hope that his family would eventually come around and instead was left with cold shoulders and greedy hands. There were several entries that outlined, in calm and factual language, how Bryce had manipulated their mother, twisted her grief after my father died into an excuse for why she couldn't say no to him, how he'd used charm as currency and guilt as leverage. One page in particular kept pulling me back. It wasn't even a full paragraph, just a few sentences, scribbled in the middle of a blank page, as if the thought had struck him suddenly and he couldn't rest until he got it down. "I think he's using that investor. Told me he'd get Mom to float him another loan if things fall through. Says she won't say no. I told him to stop gambling with people's futures. He laughed. Said no one could touch him." I must have read that line 10 times. Each repetition made my heart thud a little harder. I knew the name of the investor. Bryce had bragged about it last Thanksgiving, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Some tech guy out in Denver who was looking to diversify his portfolio and saw real value in Bryce's brand. At the time, I tuned it out like I tuned out most of Bryce's self-congratulatory monologues. But now I was paying attention. Suddenly, all those little details I'd ignored, what his startup actually did, how much money he'd raised, what promises he'd made, felt like clues in a story I hadn't realized I was part of. That night, I poured myself a glass of red wine, sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, and did what I do best. I researched. Not just a quick Google search. I went deep. Company registration records, news articles, investment filings, even the guy's LinkedIn profile. And the deeper I went, the more it all started to crack at the edges. There were inconsistencies in the numbers, exaggerated claims on marketing decks, and most importantly, a set of digital footprints that connected directly to a series of private transfers from Mom's bank account into a shell account that Bryce controlled. Small amounts at first, but growing over time. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Jack hadn't just been documenting personal grievances. He'd been quietly building a map of Bryce's deception, anticipating, maybe even hoping, that someone would use it when the time came. And now, the time had come. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was too loud, filled with spinning wheels and imagined conversations. What if I exposed him? What if I sent this information to the investor? What if I didn't? Was I ready for what would come after? Because it wouldn't just be Bryce who paid the price. Mom would feel it too. The whole fragile framework she'd spent her life protecting, her golden boy, her carefully curated illusion of family harmony, it would all come crashing down. But then I remembered the way she'd dismissed me on the phone. The way she'd said I played nurse, like I was angling for something instead of doing the right thing. I thought about how she never once called after Jack died to ask if I was okay. How every act of mine was filtered through suspicion while Bryce's sins were rewritten as mistakes. I closed the laptop slowly, stood up, and stared out the kitchen window. The street was quiet. No cars, no movement. Just that thick suburban stillness that sometimes feels like peace and sometimes feels like suffocation. And in that silence, I made a choice. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I wasn't going to bury the truth to protect someone else's comfort. I opened my phone, created an anonymous email address, scanned the most damning pages from the journal, and attached them. I wrote a short message, nothing dramatic, just the facts, a suggestion to verify the bank records, and a warning. This may affect your investment more than you realize. Then I hit send. The message disappeared into cyberspace, quiet and unassuming, but I knew what it carried. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was justice, a long overdue correction. Later that night, Bryce texted again. "Want to meet up this weekend? Mom says we should talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed a reply. 4 words only, each one soaked in something colder than hate. "It's already begun, Bryce." And I meant it. The fallout began exactly 72 hours after I clicked send. That morning, my phone lit up with a dozen notifications before I had even managed to finish brushing my teeth. The first was from a mutual friend, someone from high school who, despite living 3 states away now, had somehow never stopped tracking every tiny ripple in the Winters family's endless pond of drama. "Is it true about Bryce's company? My cousin's husband just pulled his investment. People are saying someone sent over documents, bank stuff. Thought you'd want a heads up." I stared at the message, toothbrush still in hand, and felt the corners of my mouth twitch into something that wasn't quite a smile, but carried the same weight. Later that same afternoon, the silence cracked wide open. Bryce finally called me. Not a text, not some casual, emoji-laced jab. A real phone call. I didn't answer. I watched the screen flash and pulse until it stopped, let it go to voicemail, and then sat there in the middle of my living room, surrounded by folded laundry and the scent of day-old coffee, knowing that for the first time in his life, my brother wasn't calling to gloat. He was calling because he had lost control. Eventually, I played the voicemail. His voice was low and clipped, every word measured but teetering on the edge of panic. "Nat, we need to talk. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. This is bigger than just us. You don't want to drag the whole family into this. Just call me back, all right? We can fix this." I listened twice. The second time, I caught what I'd missed the first. The tightness in his throat, the cracks between the syllables. For a man who had built his entire persona on the idea that nothing could shake him, Bryce sounded terrified. It was tempting to call him back, to finally have it out, voice to voice, without the shield of sarcasm or secondhand jabs passed through our mother. But that would have given him something he didn't deserve, access to my peace. So instead, I did what I'd learned to do over years of being ignored, doubted, and quietly dismissed. I stayed silent. I let him sit in it. The next blow came from Mom. That evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the walls of my living room in amber light, she showed up at my door, no warning, just her beige sedan parked crooked in the driveway, and then her knock. 3 short taps, fast, like she didn't want to give herself time to reconsider. I stood there for a moment, one hand on the doorknob, debating whether to pretend I wasn't home. But then I opened it, Slowly, deliberately, she looked smaller than usual, less put together, her lipstick smudged, eyes rimmed red, and her cardigan mismatched with her skirt like she had dressed in a hurry. There was no opening pleasantry, no attempt at pleasantries at all. She stepped forward, and I stepped aside, letting her into my home like I was letting in a storm. She turned to face me in the hallway, her voice sharp and brittle. "You ruined your brother." It took everything in me not to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because of how fast she had found a villain in the story, and how unsurprising it was that it had to be me. "No," I said, keeping my voice calm. "He ruined himself. I just stopped protecting him from the consequences." She didn't respond right away. She just stood there, breathing heavy, as if she expected me to break into tears or ask for forgiveness. As if this was another one of those moments where I was supposed to retreat, to make space for her pain, to carry the guilt she didn't want to feel, but I didn't move. "He said you made up lies," she said after a while, softer now but still clinging to that same script. "That you're angry about the car, and you're trying to hurt him." I nodded slowly. "He also said he didn't steal money from Jack, and yet we both know he did." Her face twitched at the mention of Jack, and for a flicker of a moment, I saw something behind her eyes that looked like shame, or maybe fear, but it passed quickly. She looked away toward the kitchen, toward anything that wasn't me, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "You sent something to his investor?" "I did." "Do you know what that means for him? He could lose everything." The way she said it, like it was a tragedy, like it was an accident that just happened to fall from the sky, it made my jaw tighten. "So could Jack," I said, stepping closer. "He could have lost everything, but he didn't, because he kept his mouth shut. And then he gave me that journal, because he knew I was the only one who wouldn't." There was a long pause. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. "Why didn't you come to me first?" It was almost laughable. The idea that I would have gone to her, as if I hadn't spent a lifetime being told to keep the peace, to let it go, to not make waves. "Because you've always believed him first," I said. No bitterness in my tone, just the simple truth. "Even when you knew better." She left not long after that, her silence louder than any door slam. I watched her go from my front window, her figure small and hunched, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to follow, to fix, to smooth over the jagged edge she carried with her. I let her go. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled. Bryce lost his job, his funding, and most of his social currency in the business circles he had spent years trying to charm. I heard whispers about possible legal trouble, about breached contracts and investor fraud, but I didn't chase down the details. I had no interest in watching the collapse. I had already lived through enough of it. I kept the journal tucked safely back into the garage, inside a lockbox I bought just for it. I never showed anyone the worst page, the one that hinted at something deeper, more personal, something that could have destroyed him entirely. I didn't need to. It was never about vengeance for me. It was about shifting the weight back to where it belonged. I never fixed the dent in the car. People ask me about it sometimes, mechanics, friends, neighbors, but I always gave a vague answer, something about sentimentality or waiting for the right parts. The truth is, I left it there on purpose. It reminded me of that night in the driveway, of the moment things started to change, of the crack that finally let the light through. Now, when I drive the Impala, I don't just feel like I'm honoring Jack. I feel like I'm honoring every version of myself I had to kill to survive in that family. The quiet girl, the apologetic woman, the sister who swallowed her voice until it became something sharp and necessary. And sometimes, when I park the car and catch my reflection in that dented door, I ask myself a question I've never fully answered. If I had gone further, if I had used everything in that journal, not just the safest parts, would it have been justice or cruelty? And if I'm being honest, I still don't know, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the hardest part isn't deciding what you're capable of. Maybe it's deciding who you're willing to become to get it.